Welcome to my weekly best decks roundup for Marvel Snap. This week we've got some interesting metrics to go over thanks to the release of our latest card, Arishem. Arishem is easily the most popular card to ever drop in Marvel Snap, with untapped metrics putting it at over a 70% play rate among players in the top half of Infinite. This incredible play rate means that the metagame that we are looking at for this week from a data perspective has become incredibly inbred. One of the clear examples of this being the case is that Darkhawk, while not quite at the 70+% play rate that Arishem has, is currently north of 40% in terms of its play rate when it was single digit percentages prior to Arishem dropping. And it's not just dedicated traditional Darkhawk decks playing this card. A lot of the Arishem decks are playing Darkhawk simply so they can have a 5 energy bomb to sling at each other inside of their mirror matches. This brings us to the first Arishem deck list I wanted to highlight that contains a number of inbred traits and has to imagine what I would wager is one of the most frustrating mirror matches of all time. You have Darkhawk with no support just because it's very large. You have Rogue and Shang-Chi to deal with opposing Darkhawks and large things like Blob. And then you have Loki so you can get your opponent's Darkhawks and Blobs, and your opponent's probably also playing Loki so they can take your Rogues and Shang-Chi. And this deck, I think, basically embodies the type of thing that people who like to complain about Loki as a tech card hate, which is that it's playing a bunch of cards that are really good against itself. I'm going to go on to soapbox here for a minute about Arishem decks and something that I'm viewing as a pattern. Pouring over lots of different Arishem lists that are logged on Untapped, there are a lot of variations that have hundreds or even thousands of games in the case of this most popular list here, but also a lot of them have really key similarities. It seems that the only lists that people are playing in any significant sample size are basically all featuring Loki and Darkhawk and these tech cards that also counter your big things like your Darkhawk and Blob. It feels like there is very little people trying to truly innovate outside of these core things that a small number of people have decided must be optimal. To offer something that is a counterpoint of view to what all of these more popular lists seem to be doing, Loki in particular is a card that has seemed incredibly lackluster inside of Arishem, both when I've played with and against it. These Arishem decks are playing 2 or 3 cards that add extra cards to your hand, but you have to remember your deck is twice as big as a standard Marvel Snap deck. This would be like playing 1 or 1.5 cards that add extra cards to your hand than a typical Loki deck, which any reasonable person would tell you is not nearly enough to leverage Loki consistently. This means that when you're playing Loki in these Arishem decks, it's regularly only giving you somewhere between 2 and 4 cards, as opposed to the almost full hand that you often get in the other Loki decks. This means when you're playing against someone whose deck has any sort of synergies in it, you're often getting mismatched pieces that don't work well together and are pretty individually weak, even if they have a little bit of a discounted cost. It feels like we kind of jumped the shark in a way where we went straight to these inoptimized Arishem decks inbreeding to kind of fight each other, because Lokiing your Arishem cards into the opposing Arishem tech cards feels kind of good, but what the decks are doing feels like it leaves them a bit individually weak. I spent the day, for example, playing non-Arishem decks in Infinite Conquest, and every time my opponent's Arishem deck played this Darkhawk out against my 12-card deck, it was just this incredibly embarrassing 7 or 9 power 5-drop that just wasn't really functional. I know some of you are thinking, okay, Jeff, what in your opinion does innovation look like then? And enter my preferred Arishem deck list at the moment, this Arishem tech list. This deck list has the important tools that you need to be competitive into things like Darkhawk and Blob, thanks to our tech cards like Shang-Chi, Shadow King, and Enchantress, but it also has its own proactive disruption like Mobius, as well as cards like Sarah that allow us to cheat on energy ourselves, and Namora, who put really big stats into play that are resistant to both opposing tech cards or when our opponent Loki's us to borrow our own. One kind of core deck building principle that's come to the forefront in my mind when thinking about Arishem decks is that 3 and 5 energy cards really seem to be like the key thing that I want to lean into. 3 energy cards give us proactive things to do early, starting on the second turn of the game, and we don't mind playing 2 of them on turn 6. And 5 energy cards in Marvel Snap are really where you start to generate big power, because typically you need to wait till later turns to get them down. Getting to slam Sarah on turn 4 consistently when you draw her feels incredibly strong, and Namora coming down on turn 4 means that we can get her trigger to happen while still having 2 more turns to set up after the fact, playing additional cards into the lanes that she already buffed up. Legion has also consistently been an all-star for me in a variety of decks, and he feels extra powerful when you get to play him as early as the 4th turn of the game. I'm definitely not the only one innovating with Arishem a little bit. Another list that caught my eye when pouring through the metrics that had promising stats in a small sample size was this high evolutionary Arishem variation. One start of the game effects thing to note here is that the order that Arishem and High Evolutionary trigger at the beginning of the game currently is random, which what this means is half of the time when Arishem generates you Wasp or Hulk or another ability list card, High Evolutionary will add powers to it, and the other half of the time it's just going to stay vanilla. This deck list is notably leveraging Shang-Chi and Enchantress as a way to interact with opposing Darkhawks without leaning into inbred things like that itself, so its cards can stay individually powerful. It's also worth noting that High Evolutionary is a natural predator to opposing Lokis, since Loki's always getting the base variations of your cards and never the evolved ones. This deck list in particular is really sweet because it's especially new player friendly, because if you have High Evo and Arishem, most of the rest of the cards in this deck list are Series 1 and 2 with a sprinkling of Series 3, such as She-Hulk. Speaking of higher series cards, I didn't really get into specific replacements in any of these Arishem decks, and part of the reason for that is outside of Arishem, you could pretty cleanly substitute basically anything inside of these decks, because unlike other Marvel Snap decks where you're going to see your stuff 75% of the time, you're only 37.5% to see a given card in an Arishem deck by the end of a typical game, meaning anything you substitute out is much lower impact here than a substitute in a regular Marvel Snap deck. If you're looking to swap a Series 4 or 5 card that you're missing, look for something else that has a similar energy cost and serves a similar function, and you'll have an easy swap. Moving on to non-Arishem decks, my regular viewers are going to take note that there's no top performing category in this week's roundup, and the reason for this is quite straightforward. Arishem has been such a popular card that all of the non-Arishem decks we are about to cover have sample sizes that are on the very statistically smaller side. That means while their performances are quite strong in these small samples, I only feel comfortable putting them in the high potential category because they don't quite have the numbers that I would normally like to see to call them consistent top performers. Our first high potential deck list this week is a Ravonna Athena variation. This archetype has been putting up consistent metrics since Athena released, and this very successful build has a little bit of an inbred twist at its top end, featuring Darkhawk with no support for making it larger. You're basically just looking to leverage as a big 5-drop against Arishem decks. This deck list is also playing Mystique, that only copy your Darkhawk against Arishem, but it's playing Iron Man as well, so in your non-Arishem matchups, Ravonna can let you slam double Iron Man on the last turn of the game, taking 2 of your lanes and making them absolutely massive in a way that's going to be difficult for your opponents to keep up with. This deck list has a variety of other just generically good statted cards, from the scaling package at the bottom to Sage and Mockingbird at the top end. As far as must-have cards go, the small scaling package, Kitty, Athena, Angela is definitely not something you can replace, and then Ravonna and Hope Summers also feel pretty important in this core for accelerating out your big plays ahead of time. Mockingbird and Sage, I think, are the easiest to replace, with other things like Wolfsbane that scale up in stats, but work with Ravonna being the easiest thing to put into those slots if you're missing them. Mobius and Mobius is just a generic tech card in this deck, so other things that have been in the slot before are like Shang-Chi or even Professor X to give you some utility depending on what you want to be playing into. Our next high potential list features Darkhawk as well as the Black Bolt stature package and Miles Morales with a small move package, so we have a variety of other ways to add efficient stats to the board. It's also worth noting that this is a more dedicated Darkhawk deck. It's not just trying to metagame Arishem decks. We have Korg as well as Rockslide to make sure that our Darkhawk is quite large even against 12 card opponents. I really love the inclusion of Miles and stature here because not only can we play one of them cleanly alongside Darkhawk on the last turn of the game, but if we happen to get both of them enabled, we can play them out for 13 points worth of stats alongside a tech card like Shang-Chi or Rogue, or even a proper Spider-Man to move things around the board in a way that can be incredibly disruptive to our opponents. The one card in this deck list that gives me personally a little bit of an eyebrow raise is definitely Fastos. It's worth noting that his cost reduction does not stack with Miles or Stature, so it doesn't make them free, but it is worth acknowledging that giving plus 2 points worth of power to either of those cards when they cost 1 does offer potentially really large swing. This deck list also ends up being incredibly budget friendly, with Darkhawk being the only must-have higher series cards. If you need to replace Nocturne, you can substitute her with Silk or Nightcrawler that gives you another mover to enable Miles, and then Fastos might honestly just be better as Black Widow if he's missing in your collection or not. Our last Darkhawk list today is one that's more dedicated to the card, again featuring Korg and Rockslide as well as Black Widow to make sure he's large regardless of your matchup, but it also mixes in a secondary archetype in Clutter, which I think is another excellent way to be attacking these Arishem decks. The fact that these Arishem decks have extra energy means they play out more cards than the average Marvel Snap deck does, making all of their board spaces more valuable, so a well-placed Debris or a Nihilist kicking a hood across the board can often throw a large kink in their plans. This deck list also gets to leverage Mockingbird as well as Circe at the top end of the curve, additional way to put stats into play, meaning you're not simply a one-trick pony leaning on your Darkhawk. Darkhawk and Annihilus are definitely the must-have Series 5 cards for the shell, with White Widow being replaceable by another generically good 2-energy card like Lizard or Jeff, Circe cleanly substituting out for something else that can clean up the mess Sentry leaves behind like Lady Deathstrike, and Mockingbird being replaceable by something like Sage or even Wolfsbane that gives you another large stat stick at the top end of your curve. Past just Darkhawk, traditional Clutter lists are holding their own into Arishem decks as well, with this variation featuring not only Cannonball, but also Stegron, one of my favorite underplayed cards in the game, putting up good metrics in a smaller sample size to meet this week's high potential list. The core of this Clutter deck has been around for the while. I think Debris in particular, especially in tandem with Dr. Octopus and Magic, being quite well positioned. If you can pull a lot of things your opponent has into play, you can basically make that turn 7 from Limbo be one-sided, where your opponent's board is completely full while you have free reign to interact with them with your cannonballs or simply slamming down something massive like a Red Hulk. As far as higher series cards go, White Widow is actually the only one I describe as being must-have to play this archetype at efficiency. She simply helps us hit that critical mass of cards that gum up the opponent's side of the board to really lock them out of the game going into the 6th and 7th turn. Cannonball can easily be substituted for something like Shang-Chi, and a lot of the other cards, Nebula, Sage, and Red Hulk, can be substituted out for other things that make you big numbers. You could play Magneto at the top end to actually age with your Clutter game plan, and with Sage, you could substitute something like Mojo or even Polaris, who again can kind of push your opponent's stuff around in a way that's really beneficial for a deck that's looking to lock them out. Our last couple high potential deck lists this week aren't interfacing with Arishem in any particular way, but they're efficient combo decks that consistently generate big numbers that Arishem decks aren't always going to be able to keep up with, because finding your tech cards consistently in 24 cards is no mean feat. We have Wong Nomura as the first of these, which has consistently been one of the best performing decks in the metagame since Nomura released. You have a few different great angles of attack in this deck. You can Nomura massively onto 2 big movers and slide them around going into the last turn. You can Wong White Tiger Odin to pump out cats all over the board. You can combo with Ironheart and Sage. I think it's really important to understand that this deck list has a lot going on in it. It's definitely not just a one-trick pony. Our last high potential deck list is the Phoenix Force Loki core that we talked about last week that I think is even better positioned today. Your Phoenix Force game plan gives the Arishem decks a run for their money, generating numbers that they're going to have a hard time keeping up with, and the Loki aspect of this deck just absolutely massacres these really inbred Arishem builds, since he'll give you their copies of Darkhawk and their Rogues and their Shang-Chi's, so you can use them to great efficiency against themselves. As far as higher series cards go, Loki and Phoenix Force are obviously not optional here. Ghost Spider subs cleanly for another move enabler like Iron Fist or Doctor Strange. Alioth can be a different tech card like Shang-Chi, and Nico Minaru and Snowguard can be a mixture of other cards that add things to your hand, such as Maria Hill or other destroy enablers like Deathlock, depending on which half of your deck you're more interested in leaning into. Lastly, before we're done, I wanted to sneak in one of my own personal pocket picks in Black Swan Bounce. This deck list has been the most fun thing I've played in Marvel Snap in the last couple of months, with Bounce decks always being a personal pet favorite of mine. It always feels incredibly satisfying to figure out not only what turns I want to play my cards on, but also which sequence goes on those turns, and the dynamic that Black Swan, Sasquatch, and Hitmonkey have in this deck add a whole new layer of min-maxing and optimizing those turns 4 and 5 to not only get the most stats into play, but also dodge and weave against opposing tech cards to the best of my ability. One card I'd like to call out in this particular shell that I always get a lot of questions about is Titania. The key to playing with Titania well is actually quite simple. You basically should not put her on the board before turn 6 unless you're able to play her out in a way where you're going to deterministically know where she's going to end up at. This means the most common scenario where we play her out early is when your opponent has one spot open in a lane and you deploy Titania as well as one card behind her to bounce her across the board so she can sit on the opponent's side until the last turn of the game when you pull her back, letting you win that lane deterministically. As far as must-have higher series cards go, I think Hitmonkey as well as Black Swan are not negotiable must-have for this deck. They are responsible for a lot of your burst and power that you're going to bring to the table. Nico Minaru and Kitty are good, but definitely replaceable by other good one energy cards such as Iceman for disruption or Hawkeye for another card that can add stats to the board. Sasquatch is a card that's definitely like B- at best, even if she does shine here. So if you're missing her, she could easily swap out for something like Sage or Collector as another cheap card that scales up in points over the course of the game for you. Wanted to close this best decks roundup by answering a question pointedly that I've been asked on stream a bunch already since Arishem release, which is, do I think Arishem needs to be nerfed? And honestly, I think that question is just really ridiculous. The card is incredibly popular because it's neat and novel and has basically created a new sub-mode of Marvel Snap that people are excited to play. I think the popularity of this card means that we genuinely don't know what the metrics will look like against the non-Arishem field because we're playing so many mirror matches. By no means do I think the card is bad. In fact, I would be surprised if some iteration or multiple iterations of it aren't incredibly competitive. But I also think, just based on how high its play rate is as the new hype thing, we just don't have objective or even good anecdotal data to know if it's actually too good and needs to be adjusted. I think we're very likely to see its play rate come back down organically over the course of the next week or two as we get into the season and other new shiny things come up, but I also wouldn't be surprised if its play rate stays at a pretty healthy 10, 20, or even 30% as the novelty of this card remains. It's really fun and it's unique, and if it needs an adjustment down the line, that could be a thing that happens, but I definitely don't think it's a question that probably even Second Dinner has the data to answer as of yet, just because of how incredibly popular it's been to start. As always, if you enjoyed my breakdowns and deck recommendations this week, I'd encourage you to snap that like button to help this video reach some more people, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss my weekly deck roundups here and other breakdowns of everything that's going on in Marvel Snap as a whole.